Researchers who take Bigfoot seriously don't take every alleged Bigfoot video seriously. In fact, they're often the first to call foul on the fakers. So when they tell us they've seen video they think is legit, we take a look too.
Snow slammed against the old cabin like a living thing that night. The storm was the worst anyone had seen in decades. Trees cracking, power gone, wind screaming through the valley. Alone at 72, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me, until I heard it. A sound no storm could make. 2 small cries outside my door. Weak, trembling, almost human. When I opened that door and saw what was waiting in the snow, my life and everything I believed about this world changed forever. What would you have done if you'd found 2 freezing baby Bigfoots begging for help? The storm that changed everything. It started as just another mountain winter, but by nightfall, the wind had turned wild, alive, almost angry. The radio warned of a once-in-a-decade blizzard, yet nothing could have prepared me for what came crashing down from the sky. Snow fell like powdered glass, stinging my face even from behind closed shutters. The temperature plummeted so fast, the air itself seemed to freeze solid. The roof moaned, the windows rattled, and my cabin, my sturdy familiar shelter, felt suddenly fragile against nature's fury. I could hear trees splitting apart in the distance, sharp cracks that echoed through the forest like gunfire. The power went out around 2 in the morning. In the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the walls seemed to pulse with the storm's rage. I remember feeding the fire until my hands ached, praying the chimney would hold. But then came something stranger than the wind. A slow, rhythmic thud against the outer wall. Steady, deliberate, and far too intentional to be falling branches. My stomach twisted as I froze in place, straining to listen. The sound moved, first on one side of the cabin, then another, as if something was circling the house, testing it. The chickens had gone silent hours ago, and even the storm's howl seemed to fade behind that repeated knock. Whatever it wasn't the wind, and in that moment, I realized how thin a wooden wall can feel when you're truly alone in the wilderness. The cry in the blizzard. Sometime past midnight, after hours of sleepless fear, I heard something new, something that didn't belong in the chaos. A cry, faint at first, then clearer, rising and falling like the wail of a child lost in the dark. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees. This sound had feeling in it. Pain, fear, desperation. It cut through the storm like it was begging to be heard, reaching straight through the walls and into my chest. For a few long seconds, I sat frozen by the fire, my mind trying to reason with my instincts. No one could survive out there, not in that cold. No animal could sound so heartbreakingly human. But the crying didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, trembling through the wind like a plea. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Against every ounce of common sense, I pulled on my heaviest coat, grabbed a flashlight, and forced open the door. The storm hit me like a wall. Snow whipped against my face, and the cold bit into my skin so sharply it burned. I could barely breathe. The world outside was a blinding blur of white and wind, yet I pushed forward, one step at a time, guided only by that fragile, haunting sound. Each gust felt like it wanted to shove me back inside, but something deeper kept me moving, a voice in my gut that said someone out there needed me. The snow was already up to my knees when the beam of my flashlight finally caught something moving near the base of the cabin. 2 small, huddled shapes pressed tight against the stone foundation, shaking violently. For a heartbeat, I thought they were children, maybe lost hikers caught in the storm. But when one lifted its head, my breath caught in my throat. Their eyes were too large, their faces too smooth and wild all at once. They weren't human, not quite, and yet there was fear and hope in their gaze, pure, pleading and alive. 2 tiny beings, trembling on the edge of death, reaching out for warmth in a world that had forgotten mercy. They were covered in dark brown fur, matted with ice, their limbs long and strangely proportioned. Their faces looked heartbreakingly familiar, like us, but not. Eyes too large, noses flat, and an expression that could only be described as pleading. Fear should have stopped me, but it didn't. Every instinct screamed that these were babies, and they were dying. I knelt beside them, my hands shaking from more than just the cold, and wrapped them both in my coat. They didn't resist, just clung to me, making soft, trembling sounds that felt almost like words. I carried them inside, staggering through the wind, praying I wouldn't fall. Inside, I laid them by the fire, wrapped them in blankets, and watched as their bodies shook uncontrollably, trying to fight off death itself. As the warmth returned, they stirred, blinking up at me with those dark, intelligent eyes. One reached for the firelight, then for my hand. That was the moment I stopped seeing monsters. These weren't beasts from old mountain legends. They were children, someone's children, and they trusted me to keep them alive. The night they became family. By the next morning, the storm was still raging, but the two little creatures I'd pulled from the snow were no longer on the edge of death. Their breathing had grown steadier, their fur had dried and fluffed up, and there was a soft warmth returning to their bodies. I sat close by the fire, watching them sleep, still trying to understand what I was looking at. Their faces were peaceful now, the strange mix of human and animal softened by the glow of the flames. When the larger one finally stirred, blinking awake, it didn't seem frightened. It looked straight at me with eyes so dark and alive that I forgot to be afraid. They learned quickly, faster than I thought possible. When I added wood to the fire, they watched closely, mimicking my movements, passing small logs from the pile near the door. They figured out that the fire meant life, that warmth came from flame, and that the light kept the cold at bay. They didn't speak in any language I could recognize, but their soft murmuring sounds were full of tone and meaning. The larger one would make a low, gentle hum whenever it was trying to calm the smaller one, who seemed more timid and stayed close to me most of the time. It reminded me of when my own children were young, whispering to each other in half words and laughter before they learned how to talk. By midday, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter in a storm. It felt alive. They followed me everywhere, curious about every little thing I did. When I cooked, they sat by the stove, heads tilted, watching me stir the pot. When I read aloud to pass the time, they would sit cross-legged beside the fire, listening to the rhythm of my voice, as if the sound itself fascinated them. The smaller one would occasionally reach out to touch the book, running its long fingers over the pages like it was trying to understand what I was holding. Their intelligence was undeniable. They weren't wild creatures. They were learners, thoughtful, gentle, and connected in ways I couldn't explain. Something changed in me that day. I had spent 15 years alone in these mountains, my only company the wind, the trees, and the occasional deer wandering through the yard. But now, the silence was gone. The cabin felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Their soft noises, their quick learning, their careful eyes, all of it filled the space with life. The smaller one even started sitting beside me, its small hand occasionally resting on my arm, as if to say, "I'm safe now." That night, as the storm howled outside, the two of them curled up by the hearth, their bodies pressed together in sleep. I sat awake, feeding the fire and watching over them, realizing something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. In just a single night, my loneliness had been replaced with something extraordinary. I wasn't just their rescuer anymore. Somehow, without words, without understanding how, we had become a family. The tracks in the snow. When the storm finally ended, the silence was almost too much to bear. After 2 days of roaring wind and blinding snow, the quiet felt strange, like the world was holding its breath. I stood by the window that morning, the light so bright it hurt my eyes after being trapped in darkness for so long. The world outside was completely transformed. The trees were bent under the weight of the snow, the fence was buried, and the chicken coop looked like a small white hill. Everything familiar had been swallowed by winter. The two little creatures stirred beside the fire, restless and alert, as if they sensed that something had changed. I decided to step outside and check on the damage. The snow came up to my thighs in some places, but the air was calm, the kind of stillness that only follows chaos. I opened the cabin door, the hinges frozen stiff, and the cold hit me again, sharp and clean. The first thing I noticed were the prints, huge, deep impressions in the snow that trailed around my cabin like a warning written in the earth itself. My breath caught. These weren't from any animal I'd ever seen in these mountains. Each footprint was easily 18 inches long, maybe more, and 8 inches wide. The shape was almost human, but not quite. The toes were longer, spread wide, and each one ended in what looked like a claw mark. The tracks weren't random either. Whoever had made them had moved with purpose. They circled my cabin twice, stopping at the corners, beneath the windows, even by the door. The pattern was deliberate, as though something or someone had been inspecting my home. The snow had stopped just a few hours earlier, so the tracks were fresh. I could see where the powder had fallen lightly into them, but hadn't yet filled them in. My heart pounded as I followed the trail with my eyes toward the forest line. The steps were far apart. Whatever had made them was tall, powerful, and capable of covering great distances with ease. And that's when it hit me. The banging I'd heard during the worst of the storm, the steady, rhythmic thumping on the walls that had terrified me, wasn't debris or broken branches. It had been them, the parents. They had been searching for their missing young, the ones I'd brought inside. They had come in the middle of the blizzard, circling the house, maybe even calling for them, but the storm had drowned out their voices. I could almost see it in my mind, the towering figures pushing through the wind and snow, desperate, frantic, following the faint cries of their children. When the forest came alive. The morning after I found the tracks, the world outside was so still it felt unreal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a white silence that stretched as far as the eye could see. I woke early to feed the fire, but something was different. The two small creatures weren't curled by the hearth like they usually were. They were standing near the door, tense and alert, staring out the window with their large, dark eyes. Their soft, melodic sounds, normally calm and curious, had changed. They were faster, sharper, filled with a kind of nervous energy that sent a chill down my spine. They knew something I didn't. I opened the door just a crack, the cold air rushing in, and followed their gaze toward the tree line. At first, I saw nothing but snow-covered pines, still heavy from the storm. Then the forest shifted. The silence broke. I heard it before I saw them, the faint crunch of snow, slow and measured, coming from deep within the woods. The creatures beside me started making low, urgent sounds, pressing closer to the door but not stepping outside. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't look away. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to move, not from wind, but from something far larger passing through. And then I saw them. At least half a dozen enormous figures stepped out from between the trees, their movements steady and purposeful. They were covered in the same dark fur as the young ones, but much larger, towering, broad-shouldered, built like the very trees they walked among. Their height alone was enough to take your breath away, easily 8 feet, maybe more. The snow barely seemed to slow them. They spread out in a half circle around my cabin, silent but alert, their dark eyes fixed on me. I could feel their intelligence even from that distance, the way predators watch. But this wasn't predatory. It was something else. They were assessing me. Then one of them stepped forward, a massive creature, clearly the leader. Its fur was streaked with gray, and across its chest and arms were scars that spoke of a hard, violent life. It stopped about 20 feet away, straightening to its full height, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The air between us felt charged, heavy with understanding. Behind it, the others held their ground, waiting for a signal. The two little ones pushed past me then, stepping into the snow, calling out in their strange musical voices. Their sounds were full of joy, relief, recognition. The leader's head tilted slightly as the young ones ran halfway toward it, then stopped when it raised one enormous hand. It looked back at me, its gaze calm but cautious, as if weighing my intentions. We stood there, human and Bigfoot, facing each other in perfect silence. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let it see that I meant no harm. And in that still, frozen moment, I realized what was happening. The family had come for their lost children, and I was standing in the space between two worlds, hoping neither one would break the fragile peace hanging in the cold mountain air. The moment of understanding. For a few seconds, everything stood still, the kind of silence that hums through your bones. The two young ones stood between me and their towering family, their small bodies trembling, not with fear but with excitement. They started making those soft musical sounds again, their hands moving in graceful gestures, pointing to me, then to themselves, and finally to the great figure standing before us. It wasn't random noise, it was communication, clear, emotional, filled with purpose. They were telling their story. I could feel it. They were explaining what had happened, how they'd been caught in the storm, how I had brought them in, fed them, and kept them warm by my fire. The leader stood perfectly still, its dark eyes flickering from the young ones to me. Its expression was impossible to read, but there was intelligence there, an awareness that felt deeply human. The two creatures kept gesturing, their sounds rising and falling like speech. They pointed at my cabin, touched their own chests, then mine, their movements full of meaning. It felt like they were trying to say, "She saved us. She kept us safe." My throat tightened as I watched them. These beings weren't wild animals. They had family, memory, love, and gratitude. After what felt like forever, the leader stepped forward, the snow crunching under its massive feet. It stopped only a few yards away, close enough that I could see every detail in its face, the deep lines, the old scars, the wisdom in its eyes. Then, slowly and deliberately, it lowered its head toward me. Not a threat, not submission, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. My breath caught in my chest. One by one, the others followed, each bowing their heads in unison, their enormous frames moving with quiet grace. It was the most hauntingly beautiful moment of my life, silent but powerful, the kind of moment that strips away every difference between species. In that snow-covered clearing, surrounded by the soundless forest, I understood without words what they were saying. They were thanking me, not as a stranger or an intruder, but as someone who had shown kindness when it mattered most. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't just saved their children. In some small way, they had saved me too. Gifts in the woods. After the family disappeared into the forest, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. For days, I kept expecting to hear their soft calls or see the small shadows of the young ones darting across my porch, but there was nothing. The forest had swallowed them whole, yet somehow it didn't feel empty. Something had changed. The woods no longer seemed like a wild, indifferent wilderness. They felt aware, almost protective. When I stepped outside, the air carried a strange peace, as if unseen eyes were watching, not in menace, but in quiet guardianship. The first sign came a few days later. I found a small pile of smooth river stones on the edge of my property, perfectly arranged in a spiral. At first I thought it was a coincidence, maybe a trick of melting snow. But then it happened again. Different stones this time, stacked neatly in a shape that looked almost deliberate. Not long after, I noticed something else. My woodpile, which I'd left messy and uneven, was suddenly restacked overnight. Tight, symmetrical, precise. No animal could have done that. It felt like a thank you, a gesture of care in return for what I'd given their young. My chickens, usually easy prey for foxes and hawks, roamed freely without a single loss that winter. It was as if the forest itself had turned into a living shield around me. Even when I ventured deeper into the woods for firewood, I noticed paths kept unnaturally clear. The snow tamped down in just the right places. Every trace seemed to whisper the same message: we're still here. At night, I would sit by the fire and think about those strange gifts. I never heard their footsteps or saw their shapes again, but I could feel their presence. They hadn't forgotten me or what I'd done. Somewhere out there, beneath the pines and snow, they were watching, guarding, returning kindness in their own quiet way. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone on that mountain. I felt protected. I felt like I belonged. Time moved differently after that winter. The seasons changed, but the memory of that storm and those two little beings never faded. Every year when the snow returned, I found myself listening for the sounds that had once terrified me. The knocking on the walls, the soft cries in the dark. But what replaced fear was something I hadn't expected: anticipation. Each winter, small signs began to appear again, like gentle reminders that I wasn't forgotten. Footprints too large to be human but too careful to be animal appeared near my cabin. Sometimes I'd wake up to faint, distant calls echoing from the forest. Low, melodic, familiar. They weren't random sounds. They were greetings. On the anniversary of that first storm, it happened. I opened my door that evening and saw them. Two figures standing near the tree line, still and silent. For a moment, my heart stopped. They were taller now, stronger, their fur darker and fuller. But I knew them instantly. The way they stood close together, the way one tilted its head slightly when it looked at me. It was them, the same two I had pulled from the snow years ago. They didn't approach, and I didn't move closer. We just stood there, watching each other in the quiet of the forest. I whispered a thank you into the cold air, though I knew they couldn't understand the words. Still, they seemed to sense the meaning. One raised an arm, a small, slow wave, before they both turned and vanished back into the woods. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, the snow falling softly around me, feeling more peace than I had in years. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.